everyone. If you didn't hope and believe that you were dead, Auschwitz was my university. It teaches you to cope with anything, to deal with any situation. These were the powerful words of our guest speaker for tonight when she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Birmingham for her 6 decades of Holocaust education work. Tonight, in honor of Yom Hashoah, which is on Thursday, and to fulfill our responsibility to never forget, it's my huge honor to introduce Dr. Kitty Hart-Moxon, OBE, to you. Kitty has shared her story of squalor, punishment, betrayal, hope, and ultimate survival in university seminars, on BBC Radio, on TV, and frankly, across the entire internet. She has written 2 autobiographies entitled I Am Alive and Return to Auschwitz. Now living in Hertfordshire, she was born in the Polish city of Lublin and was just 13 when war broke out. Not right? Oh. That's fun. Okay. Tonight you will hear and see parts of the bone-chilling story of her Shoah. We'll learn how teamwork saved her life, how prisoners on a crowded train would take turns getting breathable air through a crack in the floor. She'll speak about the kindness of complete strangers, like the German woman who risked her own life every day to hide food for her. And she'll remind us that everyone makes choices, and it's up to us to choose to help others. Following her presentation, we'll open the floor to questions or comments. So without further ado, Kitty.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Because this microphone is a little bit off. Normally it should be a lapel microphone, but this is sort of down my mouth, so if you can't hear me, please later. But thank you for inviting me to come here tonight. By sheer coincidence, it's my anniversary of liberation today, 70 years today. And in fact, I had a phone call from Germany, from the place I was liberated, this afternoon, where they're having a big commemoration. The Germans themselves are commemorating the event today. So I think we better start because I can just wait for you to sit down. Now my story is very complex, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through my PowerPoint, and after I'll interrupt it, and I then will show you just 25 minutes of a film I made. It's quite old, it's over 30 years old. I've made a new film since, but this actually is better, and I've put 25 minutes together. It's a long film, it's too long to show, but I've got, as I say, a few edited bits put together, and it still works, so we're going to do that. And in that film, you're seeing my son, my eldest son, with me, walking through the camp. I was one of the first survivors to go back when Poland was still under communism in 1978. Why did I do it? Well, there were many, many reasons why I did it. Primarily because people knew absolutely nothing, because it was behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't easy to get to. And people knew that, you know, so many thousands, millions died there, but what people simply didn't understand is the struggle for survival. And I think that bit of film just brings it home to you, how it was possible to survive. Then I was in Auschwitz almost 2 years, so it was quite a long time to survive. But the average lifespan was between 3 weeks and 3 months. That was the average. So I'm just going to start and put you right where I was born and start from there. Now, this is a pre-war map of Poland. Now it's really quite important just to see what happened, where it happened, and when it happened, and that shows it actually quite well. So if we just spend a couple of minutes to look at this map. Now I was born here, in that town called Bielsko. Lublin is there. Right the other side of Poland. Now my town was a frontier town, so it fronted all these other countries. That was Czechoslovakia and Germany, so it changed hands throughout the ages because we're so close to the frontier. The population was mixed. Loads and loads of Germans, because it was prior to World War I, it was the Habsburg Empire, and my parents were actually born Austrian, but when I was born, it was Poland. The population was there. It was Germans, Czechs, Poles, Jews, all mixed up, predominantly German actually. And very, very close to this mountain range here, 10 minutes to the nearest ski slopes, and a wonderful place to be brought up. It was a tourist town, but it had a very important textile industry, producing woolen cloth that was exported all over the world. So it was quite a well-known town. The invasion took place outside my town, just here, because we were so close to the frontier. It also took place here, if you remember history, just the Polish corridor. Now, when they invaded, the Germans split the country, and as you see, this line here, all this was annexed into Germany proper. And the population, well, the Poles were expelled from that area as well. They brought their German population into this area. And, of course, all the Jews fled at the same time as people were being expelled. Now, this area here, as you see, was called general government, and this is where they set up all the killing centers, all the ghettos, and brought people in from all over Europe into that area here, and they were just dumped there. Also the Poles from that area were dumped into that, over into here. Now, at the same time as the Germans invaded, the Russians invaded, and they came all the way as far as this line here, and that's a line of a river called Bug, B-U-G. Very important, actually, in my story, as you will hear. And that's very near to Lublin, actually. And they never left. This is today's frontier with Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, but also Polish territory. So, okay, so what happened at the point of invasion? Well, we fled. That's the first thing we did. But before I go further, I just go back into my childhood a little bit. So this is the house my grandfather built in the 1890s. Now, it was a wonderful building at one time, all on the theme of sunflowers. As you see, it's crumbling. It's actually looking better now. This was taken in the 70s, because nobody owns it, it's owned by the city. And the flats are privately owned, and people are simply not putting a lot of money onto the outside of the building. But it's coming up. There's a lot of restoration going on in the town. There were about 12 flats, all occupied by the extended family. And our next picture is, that's almost the only picture I have of my father, my brother, my mother, my grandmother, myself, sometime in the early 30s, I think it was. This is my primary school. I went to Jewish primary school. That's me here, my teacher. And that is the very last photograph prior to the outbreak of the war. So I was about 12, my brother was older, he was still in his school uniform, but he was about 16. Right, this was my secondary school. I just had 1 year, and I was taught by nuns. That was a convent school. It was actually a boarding school, but I wasn't a boarder. But I only had 1 year because, of course, the war broke out. Now, this is Poland today. As you see, frontiers have completely changed, and here you see my town, no longer near the German frontier, of course, because the Poles have been given all their territory after the war. The frontier was here, just here, and all this is now Polish territory, because the Russians, occupied the eastern part of Poland. Poland was given that area here, but it belonged to Poland in centuries prior to 1939-45. So now then we go and see what happened at the point of invasion. So we fled. That's where Lublin comes in. All right? That was our first port of call, was Lublin. We caught almost the last train and we were simply dumped. That was the end of the line. We were dumped here. So it was my mother, my father, and my grandmother. My brother, actually, all the young boys fled further east. as far as they could run. But we got stuck. That's as far, that was the end of the line, and we got stuck in Lublin. Well, what happened next? The Germans occupied the country, and they walked into Lublin 2 weeks later. Almost immediately, following the army, came the so-called Despots, the Einsatzgruppen, if you know the word. Riot police, armed, helmeted, and it was this police that initiated all the massacres, the terror, and the murder. And very quickly, things began to happen. The first thing that happened was segregation of the population. And everybody that registered Jewish was moved to another part of the city, and that became the Lublin ghetto. And I was in this Lublin ghetto almost 2 years, on and off. Why on and off? Because we tried 5 separate escapes, and most of them had to be aborted. And we'll talk about a couple of these, the first one and the last escape. However, I just want to say a little bit about the Lublin ghetto, because it was, well, you have read about the Warsaw ghetto and the Lodz ghetto, but the Lublin ghetto was pretty well more or less the same. So, well, just the worst of it, I recall, where these raids by these Einsatzgruppen, those riot police, would smash their way into your homes. Now, you never knew it was going to happen. Never. It could be during the day, during the night. People kept a watch, but that's what happened. When they came in, everything was smashed up. That's more or less what it looked like. If you had books, they were all smashed up. Sometimes they set fire to the place. They would beat people up, loot, take everything off them. All valuables had to be given up. And people were thrown out of... I've seen people thrown out of 4-story windows down onto the pavement. Because there were these roundups, of course, constant roundups. Why? Well, have a look. This is what they wanted people to do, to assemble at the bottom of the stairs. And they rounded people up in the street or whatever. And they were told they can take just one bundle or one item. And here you're seeing people that's cordoned off here, and people standing, and they've got sort of their bit of luggage. And they were told they were going to be working in munition factories or near the frontier, because there was already tension with the Russians, the Soviets. They were going to work, they were going to be taken into camps. But occasionally someone escaped from one of these roundups. And they came back and they said, these people are not going anywhere. They were taken outside the town, they were massacred. They were simply killed. Of course, a lot of people didn't actually believe this. You know, why would they kill us? I mean, they need us to back. This is exactly what happened. People didn't believe it, so they didn't take any action. Well, my father knew. My father believed that, and he knew he had to get out of the ghetto. Well, in the meantime, you had to live. My father couldn't get out of the house, because if he went out, he was grabbed and never seen again. Men were grabbed, never seen again. It was the children, like myself, that kept life going in the Lublin ghetto. So how did you keep life going? Well, whatever my father still had, which wasn't very much, he couldn't get any money, banks were shut, couldn't earn any money. So whatever my father had, he would give me, and what I had to do, I had to make my way to the non-Jewish side of the town, the Aryan sector, which was very difficult because it was all patrols and the gates, and you were not allowed to go, and you had the Jewish police and all the rest of it. Well, I did go. I went twice a week, actually. But what did I do? I would go down the sewers. So there was a manhole, you'd go down, climb down the sewers, and horrible sewage flowing, and you sort of went to the sides where there was like a traffic down below, and came up on the manhole on the non-Jewish side and bartered whatever my father would give me, and come back with bread and potatoes, flour, never meat or milk or eggs, because that was forbidden. So that's what I did. What did my mother do? She did a similar thing. My mother was teaching English before the war already. She was in England, she'd had an English degree. So my mother did the same. She took her armband or whatever, we were wearing yellow stars, went down the sewers into the non-Jewish side, and she made contact in the vicarage with a Catholic priest. And she taught English in that vicarage. It wasn't a church. I was there a few years ago because I couldn't understand how she was teaching there. And apparently it was a seminary, you know, that was next to the university, and they were actually teaching the priests, and that's why they were learning English. And my mother did that again in return for food. And so that went on for a while. But my father knew we had to get out. I mean, there was a continuously shifting population in Lublin. They were bringing people in from all over Europe into the Lublin area. And it was so crowded, and sometimes 5 families living in one room or even in a courtyard because you couldn't find anywhere to sleep. So my father decided we've got to escape somehow. We've got to get out of this ghetto. So I'm going to tell you what happened the first escape. So that was the frontier, yeah, that was the river, yeah, and we were here. So my father got a horse and sleigh. It was winter, and we all piled into that horse and sleigh, and we did manage to get out of the ghetto. And of course, we made our way. Couldn't go along the main roads because they were patrolled. So we had to go through ditches and fields with the horse and sleigh. We had to push that sleigh. We still had my grandmother. So anyway, we made our way. We did get there. We'd sleep in forests and various places, and eventually we got there. But of course, we had to wait for the river to freeze. We couldn't cross this river. It was a huge river. It did. It was winter. It froze, and we were there for some couple of weeks or so. And my father decided we must try and cross this river to the Russian side. That's the only way you could save your life, was to go east. There was nowhere else you could run. So one night, my father again got a guide and a horse and sleigh, and we all packed into that sleigh and tried to race across the river. And we almost got to the Russian side when shots rang out from both sides, and both the Russians were shooting at us and the Germans were shooting at us. And we ducked in that sleigh, and the guide just swung around the sleigh and brought us back to the German side. And we had to get away. We had to get away from there quick, because there were patrols coming, and my father did talk his way out of that situation, but we had to get away from there. Problem was, where were you to go? You had to get back to the ghetto, because you couldn't stay a single night outside where there wasn't a Jewish community, because you had to register every single night. And of course, you couldn't stay within the Polish community, because A, it was too dangerous, because they were liable to denounce you, betray you, and B, because you couldn't register anywhere. So we had to get back to the ghetto. So every time we managed to escape, we had to get back when we had to abort the escape. We got back to the ghetto. Things were from bad to worse, of course. People were dying in the street, dying from hunger. And it was very difficult to get them to the other side. You know, they got wise to this thing that people coming out of manholes. Anyway, cut a long story short, you know, we did manage for a bit and tried again, and I'll show you what happened at the last escape. Oh, it's not working now. It's not working now. Can you move it? Can you move it?
It's just a moment.
The whole thing's backed up.
Yeah, just a moment. I know what's wrong.
You know?
Yeah. We'll have control in a second. Try it
Oh.
now.
Yeah. All right. I remember what happened. Anyway, so that was the last escape. Now that's not to scale, but here you've got Lublin, and if you look at all these swastikas, we were surrounded by killing centres that we knew absolutely nothing about. That's how secretive everything was, because there was no contact with other communities. You were isolated, wherever you were. So we walked out of Lublin, and by that time, they established a concentration camp here called Majdanek, that's even in existence today, and if people go there, it's very well preserved. It's got everything there still to be seen. Now, what happened? We walked out on foot with my grandmother, and we walked for some days, and we hit on this little village here called Drobjawola. It was in the midst of nowhere, but it had a Jewish community, a Jewish farming community, and a Polish farming community. So we knew we could stay and take shelter, because we could only shelter within the Jewish community. So we stayed. Once we got there, we found out that the Lublin ghetto didn't exist anymore. 2 weeks after we got out, They razed the ghetto, they razed part of the ghetto, but they killed 43,000 people that were still in the ghetto. And those that escaped or hid were then taken to Majdanek, to this camp. Anyway, we were here, we were sheltering there, we were there almost 12 months. Well, what happened there? Well, every single day the authorities, the SS came and demanded a ransom from the Jewish community. So every day they had to give up something. First, of course, their valuables, and later on their clothes or whatever they had. Then their produce, because they were farmers. They had to give up milk, so many eggs, cows, or whatever. And there came a point we realized, or my father realized, that this community can no longer pay the ransom. There was always the threat: if you can't pay the ransom, there's going to be deportation. And we already knew what deportation meant. So there came a point where, as I say, my father knew something was going to happen. And that night, my mother, my father, and myself, we escaped into this forest, very, very, very dense forest, primeval forests, so dense that even the patrols wouldn't go in too far. And we got into the forest, but my grandmother wouldn't go. She refused to run at all, she wouldn't go anywhere. So we got into that forest. At dawn, we got into the forest. Somewhere in the forest there was actually a clearing, and we watched the deportation that was actually taking place. And it looked something like that, when all these people were gathered. You see a lot of women and children, and well, they also had motorized lorries there, you know, rounding people up. And we do know that all these people, including my grandmother, died on the 12th of August, 1942, because it's documented. There's a small museum in Belgrade, which was the killing center. That's where they died, on the 12th of August. So that whole area was in fact cleared that day. Now what were we doing in the forest? We couldn't stay there forever. There was no food in the forest. We lived on berries, and we had no water, only when it rained. I was very sick at that point because I think I was eating mushrooms, poisoned mushrooms, and I had jaundice or some food poisoning. I was really extremely ill. And of course we knew sooner or later we had to get out of the forest. And my father was afraid to go too far into the forest in case he can't find a way out. We were actually searching for the partisan groups because we knew that there were partisans somewhere, but we never found them. We couldn't find them. So the next thing was, my father was the first one to come out of the forest. And then he made his way back to Lublin. But of course, he didn't go into the ghetto because we already knew it didn't exist anymore. He made his way to the church, to the priest. Because the priest said to my mother, if there's no way out, just come and I will see what I can do for you. I don't know whether I've got the next one next. All right, yes, it just shows we're going back to Lublin. So the priest had a plan. Okay, about 2 weeks later, my mother and we got out of the forest and we found our way back to Lublin, got there. How we ever got there, I really don't know, because it was forbidden to be, you know, boarding a train. I think we actually boarded a train. Anyway, we got to the vicarage and we found my father was hiding in a coal shed. It was too dangerous to be in the church because opposite the church was the Gestapo headquarters. And I was there a few years ago, and sure enough, it's still a government building today, opposite. And of course, they were training the binoculars on the church all the time to see what was going on. So it was a very, very dangerous situation at the church itself. So the priest's plan was that, first of all, we had to part from my father, because the priest didn't think we could survive all of us together. It was too difficult. So what did he do? He had some documents for us. That was the only way you could save your life, non-Jewish documents. Right? That's what he provided for us. And he had a plan on what was going to happen. So my father was to go and work in a sawmill in some obscure village. And we never knew his assumed name. We never knew what he was called or where he was, for the sake, you know, for safety reasons. The priest's real name we didn't really know. We used to call him Krzyzewski, but we knew it wasn't his real name. because of the danger, just if we picked up, that we might just give it away. So the next thing is, no, that's not yet. So the next thing happened is the priest, that his plan was that, my father went to work somewhere else. My mother and I were to make our way into the center of Lublin from this vicarage. Why? Because they were rounding up the Poles, not that the Jews are gone. Poles, they were rounding up churches, cinemas, taking all these people that they rounded up into a transit center, sorting them out. Why? Because they were sending them to work in factories in Germany. And the priest said, you've got to get out of Poland. That's what you've got to do. You've got to go with these Poles into Germany. Because the Poles could tell the Jews much better than the Germans. They couldn't. The Germans couldn't distinguish between Jews and non-Jews. But the Poles can. The Poles knew immediately. So, that's what we had to do. So that's what happened. Mother and I made our way. We waited when there was a roundup, and sure enough, there was a roundup, and Mother and I got in while people were fighting to get out. Before we knew what was happening, my mother and I were in a train, going all the way into Germany. Now the frontier was here, just here, and we were here, quite a long way in Germany. What were we doing there? Well, we were within a group of about 50 Polish women, working in an IG Farben factory. All right, now I don't know, people probably do know something about IG Farben. IG Farben, there was an IG Farben camp in Auschwitz, if you do know about that. And in some of the IG Farbens, they actually produced gas to kill the Zyklon B gas to create people. But this IG Farben actually produced aluminium. Now, this was my assumed name, called Kadia Dobrinska. I was supposedly born in Lublin, that's where we got it from, I think. The date was wrong, everything was wrong, but it was a very useful document. It took me 50 years to find, because all these documents were in the former East Germany, because you couldn't get that document. So it tells you Bitterfeld, and it actually tells you IG Farben, you see, in Bitterfeld, and it dates it, November 42, and I was there until March 42. 43, sorry, from 42 to March 1943. That was my mother's name. Now she was no longer my mother, she was my aunt, and I made complicated things enormously. I had new CV, I had to remember what where I went to school, and you never knew who was going to ask you questions. And so that was my mother's name, Stanisława Szlewska. Again, total, wrong date of birth, place of birth, but there were genuine documents. There were not false documents. The priest actually got birth certificates of people that had died and produced these genuine documents. You're not seeing all the documents, this is just what I found. So, okay, so what happened next? And the next thing that happened, we came under suspicion with the Polish women. Because the Polish women realized that our accents, our Polish accents, were not the same as theirs from Lublin. Lublin has a specific accent, like we have in England. You might have people in Yorkshire speak differently to people in Wales or whatever. So that's the situation in Poland. And we were sort of right down the southwestern part of Poland. They spoke a German Polish, while the others spoke a Russian Polish. So these Polish women decided we couldn't have been born in Lublin, and they became suspicious and reported us to the authorities. Oh, but they also had spies there trying to find out who these people were that they were actually bringing in, because they didn't know whom they brought into Germany. So they were checking up on people anyway. But we were definitely betrayed. So the next thing that happened, we were taken to the Gestapo headquarters here, interrogated in solitary confinement for days and days on end. And we were not the only ones, we were around about a dozen of us were interrogated, but we were in solitary. Everybody was separated, so we never knew who said what. Anyway, cut a long story short, they did find out that the documents we had didn't belong to us. But they didn't know where these documents came from. But they did know, obviously they weren't ours. So the next thing is there was a proper trial with interpreters and, you know, like a judgment. And we were charged on 3 counts. We entered Germany illegally, we had documents that did not belong to us, and they suspected we were Jewish, but of course they couldn't prove it. However, all these 3 charges carried a death penalty. So we were sentenced to death by firing squad. So the next thing that happened, we were transferred here to this place, Halle an der Saale. That was a place where all the executions were taking place. It was a huge prison it's called the Rote Ox, and I found it it's actually on the internet, it's now a museum. And I actually found the courtyard where all the executions were taking place. It's actually on the internet. So the next thing that happened, well, we were in this big prison, and the night before execution we were told, tomorrow you're going to be executed. So we were taken out into the courtyard of that huge prison, and we had to stand with our hands facing the brick wall, and right at the back of us there were sawdust, and all the machine guns were in position. In fact, my mother said sawdust is there to mop up our blood. So she whispered to me, you see what that sawdust did. And they were all manned, you know, all these riot police, helmeted police were manning machine guns. And there was a huge explosion. And some people fell to the ground, and I sort of touched myself and realized I haven't been hit. Oh no, there was a great big laugh. They'd shot into the air. They said, oh no, oh, we're not going to kill you just like that. We must know where these documents came from. So really, that saved us at that point, because they commuted our death sentence to life imprisonment in Auschwitz. That's how I came into Auschwitz. But what happened next was we were supposed to be handed over to the camp Gestapo, who were going to find out where these documents came from. And I tell you, no one's ever survived a Gestapo headquarters interrogation, and so we were very lucky we were not actually called. I think in the general chaos, you know, they never called us for interrogation. That's how I came into Auschwitz, as a prisoner, which in effect was an advantage. Because when I arrived in Auschwitz, we were taken straight into the camp. And my mother would have never been allowed into the camp, because on arrival there was a selection, and all the people were all taken to be killed. So because we were still wanted, and because we came from prison, we came straight into the camp. Anyway, so we're now going to talk a little bit. Well, the next thing happened, we went from prison to prison. We went about 4 different prisons, and eventually arrived in Auschwitz on the 2nd of April 1943. So, well, it was a very eventful journey, but we haven't got time to talk about it. Now, I know you're not going there, you don't need to see this plan, but it is useful. It's useful. When I show you my film, it falls into place if you can just have a couple of minutes on this plan. Now, I don't know if people have realized that Auschwitz wasn't just one camp, there was a complex of 40 different camps, but 2 main camps, Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau is the death part of Auschwitz, and that's where I was taken. So Auschwitz I had the medical experiment establishment. They had a hospital there for their privileged prisoners. They had the Gestapo headquarters there. They had torture chambers. If you've ever been there, they've got torture chambers there. There were a lot of political prisoners, a lot of German prisoners, a lot of Polish prisoners. But I was taken, most of the Jewish prisoners, anyway, were taken to this, over to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So in just a couple of minutes on this. So you do know the famous picture where the train comes into into the siding, isn't it? So that's the main gate here. The main gate goes in, and here's that unloading platform. It wasn't there when I arrived, but we built that platform, and also I worked on the train, on the rails rather, and that wasn't actually opened until the beginning of 1944. Now, when I got there, I disembarked somewhere else. And this is all the women's camp, and that's what we're going to show in the film, that area here. Now, all the squares you're seeing, there's a hut, so we call them blocks. Now, the stone blocks are still there, and you'll see them in the film. All these were wooden structures, and these are rotted away and been dismantled and bulldozed, and there's just the remains of these now. This curious thing, those is called sort of saunas. Not sauna like you and I understand the sauna. It's a processing establishment where prisoners were processed into the camp, disinfected, processed, clothes were processed. Most ghastly place that you can possibly imagine. The white lines are pathways which you could never cross. It was for privileged prisoners, so you could never move. You'll see these pathways in the film. The next thing I would like just to explain, this was all different camps which we're not going to talk about. I'm just going to concentrate on this area because I worked there for 8 months, and that was the killing center of the killing center, all right? So that was gas chamber number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. Crematorium number 4 and number 5. This is that, again, the sauna building that we've had saunas here. That's a sauna building. Very important, that particular, it's called the Central Sauna, and the Auschwitz Museum has got a book published on that particular building because it had such very important functions. These huts, these are all 30 huts, but they no longer exist. Of course, they've been bulldozed, the whole area, and has been destroyed prior to liberation. Before they left, they tried to erase all traces of murder, and they tried to destroy all that area. But now this area was named Canada. Any idea why it should have been named Canada? Well, the authorities named it Canada because Canada to the Germans represented wealth. And that's exactly what it was. When you bear in mind that nearly 2 million people were brought in with all their belongings, all their possessions, with all their wealth, with all their money, their jewellery, their currencies, and incredible wealth carried in blankets and in buckets every single night. I was a night shift. So every single night we carried jewels and valuables in huge quantities. That's why they nicknamed this Canada. That was the reason. Now, at the back here, that's all wooded area, because you see that in the film. There are certain pits here. Now, I found some of these pits, you see them in my film, and that is where not only bodies were burned, but people were burnt alive at the later stage when all the gas chambers were full up and they couldn't cope with the amount of people to dispose of. So the next is a hand-drawn plan. Now it was actually drawn by a war criminal who worked there. And I was at a certain trial that I attended, and the judge asked me to draw a plan which I couldn't do. So they asked this war criminal who had already served his sentence. He wasn't on trial at the time. And he worked there. And so he produced a few plans, and that's one of it. And that shows you all the sheds. There were 30 sheds, and the sheds were full of people's belongings, all right, that were brought in. Now what he did, the way he drew this, and you see he fenced this in. Now, that's the reason I couldn't actually draw this plan, because we didn't have the run of the place, and that was my hut here. Right? Fenced in. Here were the men. Men were always separated from women. Here down at the bottom, there was the most gigantic heap of everything jumbled up. Everything that you can possibly imagine. Prams, documents, food, clothes, everything jumbled up. As high as a 3-story building. That's that sauna building. That's still in existence, and there's a very, very interesting exhibition in there. It's well worth, if anybody ever goes to Birkenau, it's worthwhile going and having a look at inside here. And that is gas chamber and crematorium number 4, and this was my hut with a direct view to the gas chamber number 4, which doesn't exist now. There's only ruins there today. Right, so that is the only picture that is actually available anywhere in the world of that area. That's one pathway, so there were more pathways, so there was another pathway. And those are the very sheds that were full of people's belongings. You see nothing, because I think that the people were shut inside and couldn't just wander around. Now, next picture is you're seeing people arriving, at the ramp, that is, you know, the unloading platform. Now, as you see, these are male prisoners of the Canada working group who've been asked to come and talk to these people, depending on the language, of course. If these were Hungarians, they had to use Hungarian prisoners. Or if they were Greek transport, they were Greek prisoners. So that is the arrival, as you can see. Now, that's a very interesting picture because it's the only one that we have that actually shows a gas chamber. And that's gas chamber in crematorium number 2. But today it's in ruins, of course. The ruins are there. That's you seeing the complete building. The next picture, oh, this is not working now. Oh, just about. Yeah, it's working. There's something going on here, obviously. In the photographs you don't see what's going on, but it's on arrival, a segregation, a selection is taking place. So people are being separated, all right? You don't see very much what's going on, but I can assure you, men are separated from women, and women, again, with children are again separated because they are not allowed to live, and they're all these people that are separated are dead within 2 hours. Down here you're seeing all people's belongings that they had to leave behind, and that's then brought to where we were working, because I was working in that part for 8 months. And here you're seeing a column of people walking. Now I assure you, these people are doomed. These are people walking towards the gas chamber. They're walking in that direction. That's the picture of arrivals. Now we've only got one set of pictures because these were found after the war, and if anybody wants to see these particular pictures, if you go on the internet and put in Auschwitz album, the album comes up and it tells you how these pictures were actually found. It's miraculous that they were actually found. Now here you're seeing people sitting, that's behind that sauna building, actually opposite my hut. These are people sitting in the woods, milling around there. What are they doing? Well, they're looking in a terrible state because they probably have travelled 7 days shut in cattle trucks without food or water or whatever. And they look in a bad state, but I assure you they are waiting their turn to die, which they didn't know. They got no idea what was going to happen. So these are people just picnicking there. And we do know that these are people that are from Hungary or Romania, something like that. That was all taken in the summer of 1944 during the Hungarian transport. This is, again, showing the Canada people at work. So there you're seeing, here are the original huts. There you're seeing all the jumble, that's just the overflow that was inside the huts. And there you're seeing girls with suitcases, emptying cases. And we do know these people came from Hungary because they brought a lot of wine. All these sort of baskets and bottles of wine that the SS then, looted and was drunk. Now that, I know it's difficult to see what it is, but these are women trying to sort out shoes. This is the overflow of the shoes that were found, that were inside the hut, trying to get pairs of shoes together, which are impossible tasks. That is inside that sauna building. Now, I did explain it's got multifunctional purpose, this building. And there were also disinfecting clothes there. And these are all bed clothes, and there's some tulips, as you can see. Yeah, people came with this, and they're all being sorted. And everything that's supposed to be, I was sorting there. I was working there 8 months on night shift, the whole of the 8 months. And I was just simply sorting men's jackets. So I had to open up I had to open all the seams because people had documents and valuables inside the seams, and it all had, and they didn't want these found in Germany. So we had to open all the seams and then fold things up and take it into that building where it was disinfected, and then it was loaded and shipped to given to the population in Germany, all distributed in Germany. Right. So, and that was where they were disinfected. I took this picture while I was there, and that's I took this picture after the war, by the way, not while I was there, while I was visiting. And I've been there about 30 times, so whenever I could, I took a few pictures. And they're still like that today, intact. So the exhibition is you know, in progress there. You can go and see it. And all the stuff that was disinfected was in these drums and then shipped to Germany. Right, well I think we'll now, can we switch over to the film? We'll have 25 minutes of the film, and we'll just go back to finish my story, because, oh, that's one thing I was going to say. When I was taken to work in that place, known as the section, the SS person who took us made a very short speech, and he said, remember, you will never be transferred back to the main camp. There's only one way out of here, and that's through the chimney. In other words, you know, we knew we were doomed, because why? Because we saw too much. He said, you're witnesses to certain things that are happening here, and you cannot be transferred back to the main camp. So most of the people actually didn't survive. Right. Now what we can do is just turn lights out. Is that possible?
Yes.
Yeah? I don't know where the lights are. Does anybody know? You know when? Because the film was made for television, and it's not terribly good when there's big light. Yes, I'm probably going to sit down a little bit. It's a sound.
They stick inside the door. Just wait and see. Just wait and see. Have you been in this place full of people?
I can imagine this in the winter in snow, you know. That's what the fence is today.
Just put my compost myself. It's most important now. You know why? Because there are people in this world, they say that this has never happened. They're writing about it. They're saying, oh, this has all been, you know, it's not true. You are here just to see that it is true, it was true. And so that when you have children, you can bring them here and tell them about this. And I owe this to all the people that have died. I'm sure I do. Let's just go and see if we can find something. I came in the middle of the night, and I didn't come through this gate. I think I came through some side gate, and these are the rails that I have to build.
So is this where the fences were?
Oh, the fences, but the whole place was lit up when I came here. And there was a kind of smell of roasting meat. And you thought, God, surely that can't be roasting a lot of meat here. And there was a peculiar glow in the distance, and you thought, well, what the bloody hell is this glow? When you're walking along here, just imagine hundreds of thousands of millions of people walking along this road here with their bundles, tiny children, old people, some had to be carried, and they just walked all the way to the end. And don't take any notice of the grass, because there was no grass.
Well, what was
all this was mud, just a sea of mud, damp. It was damp in the summer.
And so what's supposed to snow in the winter?
Thick with snow in the winter, and it was always wet, and your feet were always stuck in the mud. See this gate?
Yeah.
Let me tell you about this gate. Now, the commandant stood here, the SS women, that's where they stood. People came to work, external work from there, from the camp. 5 o'clock in the morning, the groups went out to work, outside, digging trenches, doing what you like, right? People who were that way never came back, right? So this was
That way into the crematorium?
That's the way to the crematorium, right? So here, if you were voted through this gate, you could live for a bit. But if you went that way, you never lived. I came here during the night. Now I went into a place called the sauna, right? Where everything was taken from you. That was your very first thing that happened to you, and you were shaved, naked, smeared with some of war that were shot here just before I arrived, and we would even wear uniforms. By that I mean their trousers and their tops, and you were only allowed to wear one layer. I would like to find Block 25, because Block 25 had the most terrible significance. That's Block 27.
And this is 20.
Now this was my block. I was here for months and months in this block, and that's where I hid actually, because I pretended I belonged to a group of workers in Siemens, and I didn't. So I slept there during the day, and I slept there during the night. And here were the workers. You see, everybody was standing here. 1,000 women standing in front of each block twice a day. Right? Here stood the block headress there, the woman in charge of the block. That's where you're beaten as you got in. Every time you got in, you got beaten. And every time you got in, you got your bread brush. Look at the mud. Just look.
Yes.
That's it, back sometimes. Oh, it was worse, because people couldn't go to the toilet.
No toilet facility.
No toilet with a bucket at one end, but you had to fight to get to the bucket, or you had to have permission to use the bucket. And mostly you couldn't use the bucket, so you were lying in your own mess, and everybody else's mess, right? Now, it was very easy to lose the desire to live, let me tell you, very easy. Now, in the mornings, 4 o'clock in the mornings, you were driven out from there, and you're still here. So, in fives, here you were counted, and you can imagine that people kept on going to different blocks, because, they got mixed up. It's not always that you found your way to your block quickly enough. So you stood outside somebody else's block. Oh, boy. So if the numbers didn't match up, you stood until the numbers matched up, sometimes 3 hours, 4 hours, right through the night. This must be Block 25, because it's got the bond. Now, when selections were carried out to the gas chambers, people were stripped, mostly, they were stripped. Naked, put into there, Block 25. Now, everybody kept away from here, because through the bars you could see hands sticking out. Hands of people sticking out, begging just for a drink. Because they were naked there, sometimes 3 days, 4 days, waiting to die. And sometimes when they opened up the doors, the stench was such that you could smell it right to the camp. Now I think what we ought to do, I must tell you about the toilets. Because when I came here, there were no toilets and there was no water. Well, the prisoners built everything, of course, in here. And there was absolutely nothing. No soap, no water, no change of clothes. You soon lost your will to live here, but it was very, very easy. The best things to do in this camp was because A, you worked inside the camp, you didn't do external work usually, and B, the dead body had a ration bread, piece of bread. The dead body had one change of clothes, and it wasn't any good to this dead body, was it? I mean, I don't feel guilty about this, do I?
That's true.
Well, but this is what I thought. Well, I'm not doing anybody any harm. I'm taking this piece of bread from this dead body, and I'm taking this one pair of boots, and I can sell it. And with this, I can buy myself a place to live. Now, the water was here, and you couldn't get in, because in charge of this was some ruling prisoner with a whip. Right? Now, how do you get in? If you want to be beaten up, you couldn't got in, you see. But if you could give us something, like your bread ration, which I got off my dead body that I loaded, you see, I got myself a bit of access to go in there. And perhaps just couldn't have washed. I mean, can you imagine 2,000, well, there were 50,000 in here, just a few blocks of these, you see. Everybody had to pile in there, you had perhaps half a minute to get in there and get out. So how do you wash? You couldn't take anything off, because if you took it off, you didn't see it again, so you were left naked. And what happened then? You were as good as dead, because there was no means of getting another anything.
Right, so you went
in fully death, and you got a bit of water in your bowl. Your bowl was tied to your body. Your bowl was your life.
If you didn't have your bowl.
If you didn't have your bowl, you didn't have your soup. If you didn't have your bowl, you didn't have your toilet, because your bowl was your toilet. Do you understand?
How did you wash the bowl?
You didn't.
Before you ate?
Well, you didn't. You didn't. And you didn't wash it out. That was your life, your bowl. My bowl, it was red. Now, I don't know whether this was a toilet block or whether it couldn't be. I just don't know.
Looks like.
I think this is your toilet. And thousands of women trying their legs, and you know, sometimes during 3 or 4 hour roll call you had to do something. Now, one was sitting here, or perhaps 3 were sitting here, because you couldn't get just one hole for yourself. So you were sitting sort of like this, and somebody else was sitting there, you see. And then before you finish, somebody pushed you off because the other one wanted to go, you see. But then somebody had to work in the Scheißkommando. Now the Scheißkommando, oh God, it's too bloody funny really. The Scheißkommando was a work group, people who had to dig that stuff out, put it in buckets, and carry it to the cesspool. Now, I worked on the Scheißkommando for some time also, because I worked in most work parties here, and that was a very good work party, because you see, you were actually working inside the enclosure of the camp. It was very prestigious to be in the Scheißkommando. Somewhere there must be some wooden hut, which was a quarantine. Now, that's where you were initiated into the camp. Imagine each one of these holding at least 1,000 people. You can't imagine it. That's where I spent my first night. My mother and I, we scrambled onto here somewhere, and I was lying next to some woman, and it turned out she was a gypsy, you know, and she looked at me, and she sort of looked at my hands, and she said, "You're going to come out." I thought, oh, yeah, what are she talking about? I'm going to come out. She looked at my hands, and I think it was psychological, so it stayed with me really right through. I kept on saying, this gypsy said to me, I'm going to come out, so I'm going to live, because she said so. Anyway, I slept right through the night, because I was terribly tired. There'd been no food for about 48 hours, because we'd come from prison. And I didn't know what I was so cold. And then a whistle blew, and everybody started rushing out this very first morning. And I shook this woman, you see, and she was cold, you see, and she died in the night, and she was dead for some hours, and this is why I was so cold. And so I said to my mother, I said, now look, she's dead. I know what's got to be done. We've got to have her clothes, and we've got to have her body fashion if she's got them. It's still good for her. And then it came to me that this is the way to live. You must have it off the bed. And this is the principle that I adhere to all the time. That you must pick up the dead. You must never take anything on the people that are alive. That is yours if the people are dead. Now I know you're seeing grass, but I don't see grass. I see mud. Just a sea of mud. And believe me, if there was one blade of grass, you would have eaten it. All this vastness you see, each one of these was a wooden block. All this was a hospital section. You just look at the size of it, from there to there, and this house, about 1,000 women in here, and the death toll was, 500-600 a night. If my mother hadn't worked in here, she would not have lived 2 days. First of all, she didn't have to be outside for the roll call, so she would stay at the roll call twice a day, because the sick were not actually taken out to be counted. It was all done inside the block. And the same for the staff, so this was a very, very big advantage, not having to stand outside 3 or 4 hours twice a day. Yes. And of course we were sheltered from the elements. I mean, it's cold here today, isn't it?
Very cold.
Right, well, what are you wearing? 5 layers of clothes, eh? Right, so you imagine people in this here who are working when it snows, when it rains, when the sun is hot. In order to live, you have to find some way of working indoors. Sometimes the staff had to carry out the people in front here. They were lined up here, and the selections were carried out. Now, I went for a selection. After typhus, maybe I stood there.
Yes.
And I
wearing white gloves, if I
wearing white gloves. I came out here, I was after typhus, and I had to strip naked and run. If you couldn't run, well, you were selected to go to the other side. But of course, I was after typhus, and I couldn't run at that time. I was still crawling. I was actually on my knees. As far as here, I was on my knees. And my mother said, "Now you've got to go. You've got to stand, and you've got to run." You see? You see, I did. I around in front of him, and then he pointed that way. So I went. And one day there was a selection within the hut. Yeah. And my mother took me, put me underneath a straw mattress and put another body on top of me. I was unconscious at that time.
So she saved your life?
She saved my life because everybody that was lying on the back, on the bunk, was taken to be gassed. Everybody. And if I hadn't been underneath, well, I would not have survived. And one day Mengele came in and he said, the whole block's going to be emptied. Everybody out. So all the staff, that was our staff by then, we had to leave this area. I think it was this block over there. We all stood around here. We were standing around. They brought all the people out. And we were standing holding hands, you say, like this, so that they couldn't escape. And all the sick, even the convalescents, they were well. They were already well.
Why did he want to clear the block?
He wanted to clear the block because there were lots of new signals coming in. So he cleared the whole block. And everybody had to be loaded on. And I had to load my friends on. Don't finish me. That really finished me mentally, I think. That finished me, I'm sure it did. But it was my mother that stopped me going on the fence that day. Everybody went. Everybody.
I mean, you wanted to commit suicide?
Well, I just didn't want to live. You see, that all my friends were on this block, and they were well. And I'd been here a year, 12 months. And then I had to load them up, you see. And I wanted to go with them. But of course, they'd stop me. You see, my mother came after, she just grabbed me and stopped me. You couldn't have lived on your own. You had to have somebody to help for you to survive, and you had to have somebody else. I don't know about the men. I couldn't tell you how the men managed to survive. But conditions in the women's camp were 1,000 times worse. And all of a sudden, they came in and said they were going to form a new commando. And if you like, we can join it. And it was the Canada commando. It represented food, drink, everything that you needed. Because all the possessions that people had brought in that came over here were down there. And my mother said, well, you must. She thought, if I could just live one day and taste some food just once while I live, then it was worthwhile. Now, this is a Canada commando enclosure here. This was all pretending to be a garden, pretending to be a factory. It was all a pretense, you see, because they didn't want people to panic when they brought them in here. This patch of that you see here, this piece of grass, was actually lawn. Along here was a fence. Beyond this fence, along the road, walked the people either they saw not to live, or they came the other way from the land and to the crematorium over there, which is crematorium 4. The people were told to leave all the stuff behind, that they're going to be disinfected, they're going to be taken into the camp.
And they didn't realise what...
Well, they thought people were having a bath, a shower, because it said to the showers, please leave your clothes neatly in a bundle and bundle your shoes together so that they don't get lost. Yes, well, I think these are the remains of the Canada commando huts. The toilets were away from the blocks, and we were permitted to use the toilets. Believe it or not, it had a door, and you were, for one thing, you had privacy to sit on the toilet. And this is my very favourite spot, and when I found some jewellery or some gold, I was determined that whatever I found is not going to be handed over to the Germans. I buried it, swallowed it, I buried it, not for myself, but first of all to preserve it, because this gold and the jewellery that was found here was very useful to the men, so that they could buy ammunition, because we knew that sooner or later there had to be an uprising, and somehow it had to be paid for. It was a glorious summer, and I was on night shift, so during the day when I didn't sleep, I sat here on this lawn sunbathing, with all the screens around, with the people walking past, with the chimney smoking, but we lay down here and we were sunbathing. And I was watching over to this crematorium over there. You saw the SS-men, the extermination squad, and did the actual killing, the actual gassing. Now somewhere there was a ladder. another letter with a tin of gas, which he had in his hand, and through the skylight he just dropped in this tin, and then he quickly ran down and off he went. And then a few seconds later you heard a sort of a muffled sound, and those were people actually suffocating.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it was quiet. Soon after that, you lay here and you could see actual smoke coming out of the chimney, and those were the very people that were burning. And do you think I could believe that there were people actually burning in it? I couldn't believe it. Can you believe it? No, but people were burning, and you could hear them screaming, but you still couldn't believe it.
What did you think was happening?
Oh, I knew, but I made myself believe that I didn't. I didn't want to know, because if I did want to know, I couldn't have lived one day. Could I? I'm looking for something known as the White House. At the moment, I can't see anything. I think we're coming out of a clearing, and I think it had to be somewhere there. And I passed it on my way going to see my mother. And I think it's got to be somewhere here now. When we passed this White House, all you heard was no, pistols to the neck. So people were either going in and were shot into the neck. Now the next thing was that these bodies were burned in certain pits. At a later stage, during 1944, when all the gas ovens were full up and couldn't cope with the amount of people being brought in here, they burned bodies, they burned people alive in the pits. And somewhere here, there must be enormous big pits. Now let's just see, because I passed these pits, you see, all the way to the camp. Yes, well that's a pit, yes. Yes, I'm quite sure. Now, this is where people were burnt alive, David, just believe it or not. Now, if you would walk in here, would you think you were going to die in this pit here? It's only when I hadn't screamed did I realise I was actually burning. So I can't cry over this anymore, I'm afraid. It's just, beyond tears. There must be more pits. There wasn't just one pit. Ashes must be here, but time has taken its toll, and I think the ashes are down here, yes. Look at this. This is ash. Can you see? This is ashes. Look. These are remains, body remains.
This is bone alright. Put the tuberculation on the bone. Can you see how it's...
Oh, we shall wash it, and then you will see if it is bone, but I think it probably is, yes. Or perhaps your grandparents. Perhaps. David, you asked me how many times did my mother save my life. Yeah. Well, I will tell you when she really saved my life. And that was, she was working over there in the hospital block, as you know, and I was working in the crematorium. Yeah. Now, one day, because she was waiting for days and days and days to try and catch the camp commandant, and the camp commandant was Hessler at that time. It was Hessler, I can't remember, that was Hessler. Yeah. And she waited, and she made a decision. She was going to speak to Hessler herself. Now, this is the greatest feat that you could imagine of heroism for an ordinary prisoner to be able to get near an SS commandant. Now, she waited apparently for days. Now, I didn't know all this because I was working in the crematorium. And somewhere here, he came along, and she ran out from one of these huts here. She must have been hiding at the back of this last block. And she saw him. And of course, he wasn't on his own. He was surrounded, and there was by the ruling prisoners. And you couldn't get near. You had to speak via the ruling prisoners. Anyway, she apparently came up here, and she said, "Prisoner number 39934 begs to speak to the camp commandant." And he apparently just, a little bit surprised, an ordinary prisoner was trying to address him. No. And he said yes. And she then said, "My daughter's been working at the crematorium for 8 months. And now their transport's leaving, and I would like her to come and join me on the transport." Well, he didn't say yes or no. He just said, "Give me her number." And she said, 39934. Dismissed. And that was it. And I never heard it. I didn't know this, you see. But this saved my life. He saved my life. And how he saved my life, I will tell you. Because I worked in the crematorium, and there was this enormous uprising, and I was there when the crematorium was being blown up. And we were all implicated in this. I mean, we were responsible to some extent for the blowing up of the crematorium. And there was an enormous inquiry. And during the roll call, one of the SS women came in and called 39934. And of course I thought, right, now I'm going to be killed. Because I knew I was implicated. I had a lot of gold and jewellery, it was all hidden in a bag, and somebody else had seen it. So I said, bye. You know, everybody knew I was going to die. But instead, she said to me, you're going to be too. Be one. So be one. So the camp commandant saved my life because I don't know. He just sent a message. Get prisoner 39934 to come back here. I don't know. It's the way my mother spoke this perfect German. They admire heroism and they admire the fact that she spoke the most perfect German and she came in the most civilized way. And she didn't beg. She simply said it straight out. She didn't crawl. She was very determined. She said, we've been here almost 2 years. And he was impressed by this, that somebody, especially an old lady like her, old, well enough for 50s, could have lived here so long. He was impressed, I think. And so my number was called out, and I have not met anyone from this particular Canada commander that is alive, because I think following this inquiry, they will all guess.
Towards the end of 1944, with the advance of the Russian army, the Germans attempted to destroy all evidence of what had taken place at Auschwitz. Living prisoners began to be transported to concentration camps inside Germany. The freight trucks and cattle wagons began to take surviving prisoners away from Auschwitz. When there were no trains, they were forced to march over hundreds of miles in conditions of deprivation and brutality, worse than anything they had experienced in Auschwitz. Kitty left Auschwitz in a freight truck on November the 11th, 1944. It was 1 month before her 18th birthday. Of the 100 women who were transported with her, only 12 were alive by the time liberation came in April 1945. Amongst those 12 were Kitty and her mother.
Can we switch over, please? Can you switch it over? Oh, we'll manage those. Switch over.
So, in fact, I did meet one person. You know Batrena? She was with me. She was transferred. And we're just going to tell you now what happened next. You've heard that I was being evacuated, and I was evacuated by my mother. We've got to wait a minute for it to come. I was evacuated with my mother, and fortunately my mother managed to get, everything was list, just like you know, Schindler's List, everything was list, and my mother managed to include our names onto a list, which she thought was a good list, because there were a lot of very important prisoners on that list, which she thought meant it actually had a destination, because a lot of people hadn't had a destination, they were simply killed off. But because of all these functional prisoners, these important prisoners, my mother thought there must be a destination. So the next thing that happened, we were in this train. We still didn't know to the last minute whether the train was heading, we didn't know which side the engine was, whether it was heading to the gas chambers or whether heading out of the gate. So we didn't know until the train actually left the actual gatehouse that we were actually going anywhere. Because many times they were saying people were being evacuated, and in fact they were killed. They were taken the other way into the gas chamber. So here we are. That just shows more or less all my journeys. Okay. Oh, are we okay? Right. Okay. So we started off here, went up there, went to Germany, came back, came to Auschwitz, and I was being evacuated. Now, I was evacuated not all that fine to this. Gross-Rosen was another base camp, another concentration camp, and there were about 100 camps, satellite camps, belonging to this place, Gross-Rosen. Most of the prisoners were working in caves, actually. But I was actually working in a factory. So, that's it. I'm just looking for this particular picture.
So the next thing that happened, I was working here, at this place that I was working in an electronics factory. Now, you would have thought, you can't hear?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Sorry. It's a terrible microphone. I can just stay where it's supposed to stay. Sorry. Still there? Okay. Well, I'll explain. I was here working in an electronics factory, and you would have thought that the last 6 months would have been better out of Auschwitz, but in fact it was even worse, if there can be such a thing as worse than Auschwitz. But it was. Because the next camp didn't even have a kitchen, it didn't have any water, it had no clothes, it had nothing. You see, in Auschwitz, with all these people coming in, there was still a possibility of getting hold of things if you knew how to do it. You could still get hold of it, but there was just nothing. So consequently, what happened next? Both my mother and my own shoes had disintegrated, and we were barefoot. And actually, to survive barefoot was very, very difficult. It was almost impossible. And there was snow right up to the knees. It was this winter. We're talking about winter 1944-45. So this was it. I was in that factory, and that was in that factory where the German woman actually saved me by bringing me some food. Every morning she had hide a sandwich, which she had to hide because she was not allowed to speak to me. A German civilian woman working next to me that you explained. That's right, and that happened there. Anyway, let me just explain this because that's quite important. That is the Russians trying to liberate that area, and Auschwitz is here, and as you know, Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January 1945.